I moved into the neighborhood in late October, the kind of time when leaves clog storm drains and the air smells like damp concrete. I had taken a job an hour from where I grew up and needed something fast. The house was small, one story, with a narrow driveway and a chain-link fence that leaned inward like it was tired. Every house on the street looked similar, built in the same decade, patched and repainted by different hands. Lawns were short, windows were covered. People lived close but stayed separate. First, nothing stood out. Cars left early in the morning. Garage doors opened and closed at predictable times. Porch lights clicked on at dusk. I told myself this was a quiet place, which was what I wanted. The man across the street was the first thing I noticed after a few days. His house had no curtains, none at all. The lights inside stayed on late, sometimes all night. He was thin and moved slowly, drifting from room to room without urgency. He never carried anything, never sat, just walked, stopped, and stood still for long stretches. I assumed he worked nights or didn't sleep well. Plenty of people don't. I didn't wave. He didn't either. We existed on opposite sides of the street without crossing paths. A week in, I started noticing his schedule matched mine. When I left for work at 7:10, he was always standing in the front room, facing the window. When I got home around 6, he was there again. Not watching the street exactly, but angled toward my house. If I stayed inside all evening, he stayed in place. If I stepped onto my porch, he shifted position, slow enough to feel unintentional, precise enough to feel practiced. I tried not to look. I focused on unpacking, on cooking, on filling the space with noise. Still, I felt a pull toward the front window, like something was counting on me checking. Late one night, I woke up to the sound of a car door closing. It was close, right outside. I lay still and listened. Tires rolled over gravel. An engine idled for a moment, then shut off. I didn't hear footsteps. I waited until my breathing slowed before getting up. The street was dark. Most porch lights were off. The man's house glowed like a box left open. His front door was ajar, just a few inches. The interior light spilled onto the porch, sharp and pale. My driveway was empty. The car sat parked where I'd left it. Nothing looked disturbed. I told myself it was nothing and went back to bed. The next morning, I noticed footprints along the side of my house. The ground there stayed soft from shade and runoff. The prints were shallow but clear, heel to toe, facing the back fence. They didn't come back the same way. I checked my doors and windows. Everything was locked. The gate to the backyard was still chained. Over the next few days, small things shifted. My trash bin was turned around after collection, lid facing the street instead of the house. My porch chair moved a few inches. Once, I found my mailbox open, the latch hanging loose. Nothing was missing. I began paying attention to sounds. At night, I heard movement outside that didn't match traffic or wind. A soft scrape, a pause, then nothing. When I checked the window, the man across the street was always standing in a different place than before, closer to the door or closer to the window nearest my driveway. I started coming home at different times, leaving lights on in rooms I wasn't using, parking a block away and walking back. Each change brought a response. The lights in his house shifted to mirror mine. When I stayed in the back rooms, he moved deeper into his house. When I sat in the living room, he stood at the front again. One evening, I found a length of twine tied to my fence post. It wasn't securing anything, just wrapped twice and knotted. It hadn't been there before. The knot was neat, tight, practiced. I cut it off and threw it away. The next morning, it was back, tied the same way. I stopped sleeping well. I stayed alert, waiting for sounds, checking locks, counting hours. I installed a camera over the front door and another facing the driveway. I didn't tell anyone. I wanted proof before I sounded paranoid. The first night the cameras were on, nothing happened. The second night, the driveway camera caught movement at 2:14 a.m. A shape crossed the edge of the frame, slow and close to the ground. It stopped near my car. The angle didn't show a face, just legs, thin, bare below the knee, moving with care. The figure stayed there for almost 10 minutes without shifting. Then it backed out of view the way it came. The front camera showed nothing. No approach. No departure. The next morning, I checked the car. There were faint marks near the rear tire, like someone had pressed their fingers into the rubber. Not enough to damage it, just enough to leave an impression. I called the property records office during my lunch break and looked up the man's address. The house across the street was listed under a trust. No recent sales, no listed occupants. Utility usage was minimal, barely enough to keep lights on. No water spikes, no trash service. That night, the lights in his house went off for the first time. Every room went dark at once. I stood at my window watching the empty shape of the building. The street felt wider without that glow. Around midnight, my back door camera alerted. The feed showed the yard, still and gray. Then the image shifted slightly, as if brushed. A hand passed in front of the lens, close enough to blur the frame. The hand was pale, nails short, skin marked with small scars. It lingered, adjusting the angle. The camera went dead. I didn't move. I sat on the edge of my bed and waited. Minutes passed. Then I heard the gate creak. Slow, controlled. Footsteps crossed the yard, stopping every few steps. The back door handle turned once, testing, then stopped. The footsteps moved away, toward the side of the house. I heard the scrape of something metal against concrete. Then silence. When the sun came up, I walked the perimeter of the house. The back camera was gone, cleanly removed. The mount was empty. The wires had been cut and tucked back into the siding. Along the foundation, near the crawlspace vent, the ground was disturbed. The grate was loose. I called the police and filed a report. They searched the area, checked the crawlspace, and noted the missing camera. They spoke to neighbors. No one reported seeing anything. The man across the street did not answer his door. His house was empty inside, stripped down to bare rooms. No furniture, no food, no bedding, just footprints in dust and scratch marks near the windows. 2 days later, they found him in another neighborhood, living beneath a vacant house, using shared alleys and yards to move without being seen. He had maps drawn by hand, showing routines, light patterns, and blind spots. My house was marked with dates and times. Notes tracked when I slept, when I left, how long lights stayed on. He had been doing this for years, moving when attention built, choosing quiet streets where people assumed familiarity meant safety. I sold the house within a month. I drive through neighborhoods differently now. I notice which lights never turn off, which windows stay uncovered, which houses seem to breathe when no one is supposed to be inside. I don't assume quiet means empty anymore. I know how much can happen in the space between routines and how close someone can get without ever needing to knock. I moved into the duplex in the fall of 2013 because it was cheap and close to my job. The neighborhood sat behind a shopping strip that had lost most of its stores. The road dead-ended near a drainage canal, so there was no through traffic. The houses were close together, built in the late 70s, all brick fronts and narrow driveways. People lived there for long stretches. Cars rarely changed. Lawns stayed trimmed in the same way year after year. The duplex shared a wall down the center. My side had been empty for a few months before I arrived. The other side was occupied by a man who lived alone, middle-aged, average build. He kept his yard neat without making it look intentional. The grass stayed short. The shrubs were cut flat. Nothing decorative, nothing personal. When I moved in, he watched from his porch without waving. I assumed he was cautious. I was new. The inside of my place smelled faintly of old carpet and cleaning solution. The walls were thin. I could hear water running next door and cabinets closing. At night, I heard his television through the shared wall, always at the same low volume, always shutting off just before midnight. The first thing that stood out was how often he seemed to know my schedule. If I left early, his porch light was on. If I came home late, his door opened just after mine closed, like he had been waiting for a cue. I told myself it was coincidence. Duplex living makes patterns visible. After a few weeks, small things began to feel off. Packages I ordered were moved closer to my door before I got home. Trash bags I left near the curb were tied tighter than I remembered. Once, I came back from work to find my porch chair turned slightly, angled toward the street. I assumed I had kicked it earlier and forgotten. The weather turned colder. Windows stayed closed. Sounds carried more clearly. I noticed that when I showered, the water pressure dipped for a moment, then returned. I noticed that the shared wall was warmer in some spots than others, even when the heat was off. I assumed it was insulation settling. One evening, I lost my keys inside the apartment. I searched everywhere: countertops, couch cushions, jacket pockets. I finally found them hanging on the hook by the door where I always left them. I convinced myself I had overlooked them. The alternative did not make sense. I began locking the bedroom door at night. The habit came from a vague discomfort I could not explain. Sleep felt shallow. I woke often, usually around the same time, just after midnight. The television next door would be off. The house would be quiet enough that I could hear my own breathing. The sounds started in December, soft at first, a faint tapping inside the walls, slow and deliberate, not the random scratching of mice, more like something being tested, pressed, released. The noise moved along the shared wall, traveling from the living room toward the bedroom, then stopping. Maintenance came out and found nothing. No pests, no loose pipes. They told me old buildings make noise. I accepted that answer because I needed to. Over time, the tapping became more regular. Always late, always brief. I noticed that it happened after the neighbor's television shut off. I started staying awake to listen. The pattern repeated. Silence, then pressure against the wall, then quiet again. I stopped using the spare key hidden outside. I changed the locks without telling the landlord, planning to swap them back later. I felt foolish doing it, but it gave me a sense of control. The next day, my doormat was folded neatly in half, placed against the wall. I never folded it. There was no reason to. The air inside the apartment felt stale, like someone had been inside while I was gone. I checked the vents. The return in the hallway had been loosened. 2 screws were missing. I tightened it and replaced the screws. That night, the tapping stopped. A week passed without incident. I relaxed slightly. I told myself the neighbor had nothing to do with it. Then I found a screw on my kitchen counter, one of the same size I had used in the vent. I inspected the shared wall more closely. In the closet, behind a stack of boxes, the drywall showed faint marks where something heavy had leaned against it repeatedly. Not damage. Where? As if someone had stood there often, pressing close. The realization came in pieces. The warmth in the wall, the tapping, the loosened vent, the consistent timing. He had access to the space between units. An old utility gap, wide enough for wiring, wide enough for a person willing to force it. I stayed home sick one day to confirm it. I waited quietly in the living room with the lights off. Just after midnight, the television next door shut off. A minute later, I heard the faint scrape of drywall from inside the wall. Slow movement, careful. The sound traveled toward the closet. I stood still, heart pounding, listening to someone move inside the structure of my home. I realized how long this must have been happening. How many nights he had stood inches away without me knowing. How much he had learned just by listening. The movement stopped abruptly. Silence stretched. I stayed frozen until morning. I did not confront him. I did not call the police without proof. Instead, I documented everything. I took photos. I recorded audio. I waited for another night. It happened again 3 days later. The same pattern. This time, I heard breathing through the wall. Controlled. Quiet. Close. The police believed me once they saw the vent and the gap. They opened the wall from my side. Inside, they found a widened cavity. Insulation pulled back. The drywall thinned from repeated pressure. On his side, they found a cutout hidden behind shelving. The opening was measured and reinforced with padding to reduce noise. He had been standing there at night for months, sometimes hours, listening, watching through vents, learning routines, the packages, the keys, the chair, all tests, all adjustments. He was arrested quietly. No struggle, no denial, The landlord admitted the gap had existed since construction and had never been sealed properly. I moved out within a week. The duplex was condemned for renovation. The neighborhood stayed quiet. Cars did not change. Lawns stayed trimmed. What stayed with me was not fear of strangers, but of familiarity. The threat had lived inches away, wrapped in routine, hidden behind thin walls and shared structures. I learned how easily privacy collapses when someone decides to claim it without asking. I bought my first home in the spring of 1998, a beige two-story in a new subdivision pushed up against the edge of a city that was still pretending it was small. The streets had no trees yet. The yards were raw dirt patched with new sod. Everything smelled like cut lumber and wet concrete. I was 32, newly married, proud and terrified in equal measure. I remember unloading boxes while planes passed low overhead, the airport not far away, the sound steady enough that I stopped noticing it after the first week. The man next door introduced himself the day I moved in. He stood on his driveway with his hands folded behind his back. His hair was dark, cut close, parted the same way on every visit after that. He wore jeans and a plain button-down shirt, sleeves always rolled to the same point. He looked about my age then, maybe a few years older. His posture was stiff but not weak. He nodded once and went back to his garage. Over the years, I saw him often enough to track the rhythm of his life. He left early. He returned before dark. He kept his lawn short and bare, no decorations, no toys, no chairs. His house never changed. Same paint, same roof, same mailbox. The windows always clean. At night, one light burned in a back room until exactly midnight, then darkness. I aged the normal way. My hairline moved back. My waist thickened. Lines settled around my eyes. I switched jobs twice. My marriage ended. I stayed in the house because it made sense and because I didn't have the energy to start over somewhere else. Through all of it, my neighbor stayed the same. Same haircut, same clothes, same build. The only change I noticed was that he began wearing gloves in the yard, even in summer. At first it felt like coincidence. Some people age well. Some don't show it until later. I told myself that whenever I noticed the contrast between my reflection in the window and his face across the fence. I stopped comparing after a while because it made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain. In 2015, a family moved into the house across the street. The parents were younger than me, with 2 kids and a lot of energy. They brought noise back to the block. Basketball thumps, chalk drawings, weekend barbecues. One afternoon, they asked about the neighborhood while we stood near the curb watching a delivery truck struggle to turn around. They asked how long the man next door had lived there. I told them the truth as I understood it. I had been there 17 years. He was there when I arrived. He had never left. Their reaction stuck with me. They treated it as a mistake, not an opinion. Later that week, while walking past their open garage, I saw a stack of papers spread across a workbench. Old rental listings, inspection forms, a faded photo clipped to a manila folder. The face in that photo was the same face I saw next door every day. Same eyes, same nose, same mouth. The date on the paper was from the early 80s. I tried to find another explanation. A relative with the same name. A son who took over and happened to look identical. Old photos lying about. But the feeling didn't go away. Pressed on me during quiet moments, while brushing my teeth, while lying awake listening to planes and distant traffic. I began paying closer attention. I noticed that he never received visitors. No friends, no family, no deliveries beyond the occasional hardware store truck. I never saw lights in the front rooms, only the back. His trash cans went out like clockwork, but they were always light. No clatter of bottles. No cardboard, just small Tide bags. One evening in late fall, I woke to a dull scraping sound. It was after midnight, later than his usual routine. The sound came from his yard, metal on dirt, slow and uneven. I stood at my bedroom window and watched through a gap in the fence. He was digging near the back corner of his lot, close to where the ground dipped toward the drainage channel. He moved in a way that didn't look right. His arms extended too far, his shoulders locked, then released. Each motion came with a pause, like his body needed instructions before continuing. The work went on for hours. He never turned on a floodlight, just a single work lamp on the ground. The hole grew deep enough that his torso disappeared when he leaned in. When he climbed out, he did it carefully, testing each step as if unsure of the sequence. The next morning, the hole was gone. The ground looked new, too smooth. I told myself it was landscaping, a drainage fix, anything practical. I checked public records online. The house next door had changed hands once, on paper only. Same name transferring ownership to the same name decades later. No sales price, no mortgage, no death record tied to the address. Property taxes paid in cash at the county office every year. The realization came slowly and then all at once. I remembered small things I had dismissed. The gloves, the stiffness, the way his gait changed for a few days after heavy work, then returned to baseline. The absence of medical deliveries or visible injury. The way he never acknowledged time passing. No decorations, no updates, no markers. I understood that the man I saw was not one continuous life. He was a series. I watched more nights. I saw the digging again the following summer, always in the same area. I noticed the jerking movements more clearly. Not weakness, adjustment, practice. I noticed that after those nights, his movements improved. His posture reset. The explanation settled into place with a terrible clarity. The house had been used as a point of handoff. The name stayed. The appearance was maintained through careful selection and training. Each successor took over the life of the last, learned the patterns, wore the clothes, kept the habits intact. The photos existed to reassure renters and inspectors. The digging was not random. It was disposal. Old remains removed and replaced deeper, or relocated to avoid detection as development crept closer. Nothing supernatural was required. Only patience, planning, and the kind of discipline most people never consider. Bodies age. Identities can be renewed. Records can be managed by someone who never leaves a paper trail. I understood why he never spoke more than necessary. Why no one visited. Why the house never changed. Change attracts attention. Stability hides in plain sight. The final piece came when I noticed a detail I had missed for years. The mailbox flag. It was stiff and used. No outgoing mail. Everything handled in person. Cash. Quiet. I put my house on the market the next spring. I didn't tell anyone why. I didn't confront him. There was no benefit. He had succeeded for decades because no one wanted to be the person who pointed at something familiar and called it wrong. On my last night there, I watched from the dark as he stood in his yard, looking at the ground where he would dig next. He moved carefully, as if testing joints that were still new to him. The porch light went off at midnight. The street fell quiet. I moved away with the understanding that some people do not try to outrun time. They replace themselves within it. This was early 2020, a few weeks before the world narrowed and stopped. I parked my RV in a long-term lot outside a desert town because it was cheap and I wanted space. The town sat low and wide, all dust and sun-faded signs, built around a highway that no longer mattered. The lot was nothing more than a scraped field with numbered posts and a water spigot that leaked constantly. Most of the people there were seasonal workers or retirees drifting between places. Everyone stayed to themselves. Engines started early. Doors shut quietly. No one asked questions. My RV sat near the middle, far enough from the road to avoid dust, close enough to the spigot to make hauling water easier. From my window, I could see the edge of the lot where the sand piled higher. At the far end sat an old aluminum trailer, the kind made decades ago, dull and scarred. It leaned slightly to one side, half buried where the wind had pushed sand against it year after year. There was no power hookup running to it. No truck. No footprints around it during the day. It looked abandoned in a way that felt deliberate. The first night I heard the sound, I thought it was wind. The desert makes noise after dark. Metal shifts. Air pushes through gaps. But this sound had rhythm. A dry, dragging noise, slow, then faster, then stopping, came from the direction of that trailer. I lay still and listened. The sound traced the inside of the aluminum shell, long lines followed by short taps, as if something inside was testing the walls. It stopped before dawn. When I stepped outside that morning, the trailer looked the same as it always did. No movement, no sign of life. The sand at its base was smooth. I told myself it was animals. Rats, maybe a feral cat trapped inside. Desert towns collect things like that. The explanation worked until the next night. The sound returned after midnight, louder this time, closer to the surface. Scraping, then a pause, then scraping again. It moved around the trailer not randomly, but as if following the seams. The aluminum vibrated slightly with each pass. Sleep became shallow. I stayed aware of the noise even when it faded. During the day, I watched the trailer from a distance. The door was shut tight. The windows were dark, filmed over with dust. No solar panels, no propane tank, nothing that suggested anyone lived there, yet the lot manager never marked it as vacant. A few days later, I noticed that someone else avoided that end of the lot. People parked with wide gaps between their rigs, leaving the edge untouched. I picked up on looks cast in that direction, quick and uneasy. No one said anything outright. The silence around it felt practiced. One morning, just before sunrise, I stepped out to empty my trash. The air was cold enough to sting. As I turned back toward my RV, I saw a figure standing close to my door. He was thin to the point of looking hollow. His skin was pale under layers of damage, cracked and peeling in wide patches like a sunburn that had never healed and had been burned again on top of it. The edges lifted and curled. His scalp showed through thin hair. His eyes were set deep, fixed on the side of my RV as if listening. He stood too close, close enough that I could see the texture of his skin, the way it split along natural lines and healed unevenly. When his mouth moved, the skin around it pulled back farther than seemed natural, stretching into a shape that did not fit his face. It wasn't impossible, just wrong, as if the muscles had learned a different range over time. I stayed still. I focused on breathing without noise. He eventually turned away, drifting back toward the buried trailer with a gait that lacked urgency. His feet left shallow marks that the wind erased within minutes. After that, I stopped going out before full daylight. I locked my door even during the day. I paid attention to sounds inside my RV. I became aware of how thin the walls were, how easily noise carried. At night, the scratching continued. Sometimes it was softer, like fingertips. Other times it was violent enough to shake the trailer's skin. It always came from inside, never from the outside. I noticed patterns. The noise increased after sunset and stopped just before dawn. It never happened during the day, even when the heat climbed high enough to warp metal. I noticed that water disappeared from the communal spigot faster than expected, though no one seemed to use it at night. I noticed that small items went missing from outside rigs. A shoe left out, a bucket, a mat. People stopped leaving anything unattended. The explanation formed slowly. The man did not live in that trailer in any normal sense. He sheltered there during the day, sealed in to avoid the sun that had destroyed his skin. At night, he moved. The scratching was not random. It was exercise, keeping strength in hands that were used constantly against metal and dirt. The lack of vehicle meant he stayed close. The desert kept him hidden. The town looked the other way. I realized that the warning I had received was not superstition. It was practical advice born from experience. Attention drew interest. Interest led to proximity. The final night I stayed there, the sound came earlier than usual. It was closer, too. I heard it along the side of my own RV, slow dragging marks near the base, then higher. I sat upright, heart pounding, counting breaths. The scratching moved to the door. Fingers pressed along the seam. The handle shifted slightly, tested, then released. In the morning, I saw the marks clearly. Long, shallow lines in the aluminum, not deep enough to break through. At the edge of the lot, the buried trailer door stood open for the first time. Inside, I could see that the walls were scarred from years of contact. The floor was packed dirt. No bedding, no food, just space worn smooth by movement. I left that day. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't report anything. The lot would empty soon anyway. Lockdowns were coming. Seasonal workers were already leaving. The desert would reclaim the space. Wind would cover tracks. The trailer would sink deeper. The man would remain, adapting as he always had, using neglect and distance as cover. I understood then that the fear was not about something unknown. It was about something allowed to exist because no one wanted to deal with it. We rented the lake house in July of 2018 for a fishing trip that was supposed to be simple. A week away from work, phones mostly ignored, mornings on the water and evenings cooking whatever we caught. The house sat back from the shoreline on a slight rise, surrounded by pine and scrub oak. The gravel drive curved out of sight before it reached the road. Once you were there, it felt cut off in a comfortable way. The nearest neighbor lived in the next property over, close enough that we could see his dock through the trees, but far enough that his house felt separate. He lived there year-round, older, retired, with a face that had spent decades in the sun. He came over the first afternoon while we were unloading gear. He walked slowly, careful on the uneven ground, smiling the whole time. He said he kept an eye on the place when it was rented out. Said theft happened sometimes during the busy months. Said he was happy to watch our cars and make sure nothing went wrong. Felt helpful, reassuring. The kind of friendliness you expect in places where people depend on each other because help is far away. We thanked him. He lingered just long enough to take everything in. The number of cars. Who was driving which one. How many coolers we had. Which of us went inside first and which stayed out organizing rods. The house itself was simple. 2 bedrooms, a loft, a pull-out couch, and a big sliding glass door facing the water. The deck wrapped around that side, with stairs leading down toward the dock. The door had a lock that felt flimsy, but we were there as a group and the area felt safe. The owner had left a spare key somewhere on the property. Standard practice for rentals like that. We never discussed it openly. By the second day, the neighbor knew more about us than felt normal. He mentioned details casually, as if they were obvious. Who stayed up the latest, who drank beer versus liquor, who snored loud enough to be heard through the thin walls, who slept on which side of the house. None of it was wrong. That was the unsettling part. It wasn't guesswork. It was observation. We laughed it off at first. Small places magnify noise. Decks creak. Sound travels over water. It was easy to assume he just paid attention. But the way he knew specifics that required proximity made the back of my neck tighten. He never asked questions that led to the answers. He already had them. The first night we heard footsteps on the deck. It was after midnight. The house had settled into that quiet that comes after a long day outside. I woke to the sound of wood shifting under weight. Slow steps, evenly spaced. Someone moving carefully, not trying to hide but not careless either. I lay still and listened. The steps traced the length of the deck, paused near the sliding door, then continued around the corner. I waited for someone else to react. A cough, a voice, nothing. The steps circled once, then faded as whoever it was moved down the stairs. I told myself it was the neighbor checking on things, maybe responding to a noise or a light left on. That explanation held until it happened again the next night. The pattern repeated. Always late, always slow, never hurried, never random. The steps never came closer than the door but lingered there longer than felt necessary. The handle never rattled. The door never opened. It was like a perimeter check, done by someone who already knew the layout. We didn't talk about it directly. Instead, we made small adjustments. We locked the door every night. We closed the curtains. We left a light on inside. None of it stopped the footsteps. During the day, the neighbor remained friendly and relaxed. He waved from his dock. He mentioned the weather forecast before we checked it ourselves. He pointed out which coves were biting best before we told him where we planned to fish. Each time he was correct. Felt less like shared local knowledge and more like surveillance. The house began to feel smaller as the week went on. Sounds inside carried farther. The deck creaked even when no one was there. Sleep came in short stretches. Every night I woke at least once, listening for the first step. On the last morning, we woke early to pack and clean. The air was cool and the lake was flat. When we opened the cooler to dump the ice, we stopped. The ice was fresh, not the cloudy melt we had left the night before. The fish we had kept were cleaned, bagged neatly, and layered properly. It was work done by someone who knew what they were doing, someone who had taken their time. One phone was missing. It had been charging on the kitchen counter. No one remembered moving it. No one had used it overnight. The house showed no sign of disturbance. Nothing else was gone. Nothing else was out of place. The realization settled slowly. The house had been entered while we slept. Quietly, with purpose. The spare key had been used, or a lock that was never secure to begin with. The person who did it moved through the space without bumping into furniture, without waking anyone, without leaving evidence beyond what they chose to leave behind. When we saw the neighbor later that morning, he addressed the situation without being prompted. He framed it as a favor, as prevention. He implied that unlocked houses attracted trouble, and that he took it upon himself to make sure nothing bad happened during the night. He returned the phone without hesitation, as if it had always been safe in his possession. What he did not explain was how he entered without a key we had never disclosed, how he knew the exact timing of our sleep, how he moved through an unfamiliar space with confidence in the dark. He did not explain the footsteps, the circling, the nightly inspections. We left that day with a tight, shared understanding. The friendliness had been access. The offers of help had been permission. The attention had never been casual. It had been ongoing and methodical. Later, when I thought it through without the haze of exhaustion, the explanation became clear. He watched every rental closely because he had done it many times before. He learned routines quickly. He tested boundaries slowly. He used concern as a cover for control. The spare key was never hidden from him. He had found it years earlier and never told the owner. Each group was a temporary presence. He was permanent. The footsteps were not about checking doors. They were about reminding himself of the space, mapping it in the dark, reinforcing familiarity. The cleaned fish and fresh ice were not kindness. They were proof of access, a quiet demonstration of how completely he could move through someone else's life without resistance. We never reported anything. Nothing illegal had happened in a way we could prove. The house was left intact. Property was returned. The explanation offered fit neatly enough to discourage questions. That was the point. I no longer rent places that advertise isolation as a feature. Privacy cuts both ways. In some places, the people who watch over things do so because they believe everything within sight belongs to them, including the temporary lives that pass through. I moved there in the summer of 2013, fresh out of a graduate program and eager to feel settled. The town sat between cornfields and a river, the kind of place where people waved even if they didn't know you. I rented a small house on a quiet street lined with maples and swing sets. On weekends, the smell of charcoal drifted across lawns. Kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. It felt safe in a way that made me lower my guard without realizing it. The house next door was a two-story with beige siding and dark shutters. A couple lived there, or at least that was what I assumed. I saw them once while unloading my car. A man and a woman stood near the garage, close together, not touching. They nodded when I looked over. They never waved again. Weeks passed and I started noticing small patterns. They never had guests. No cars pulled into their driveway except the same sedan, always parked in the same spot. No packages ever sat on their porch. No trash bins went out on collection day. Their living room lights never turned on, even in the evenings when the rest of the street glowed warm and uneven through curtains. At first, I told myself they were private. Some people are. Teachers get used to observing without comment, filing things away without judgment. The bedroom light was harder to ignore. Every night, without fail, it came on at 2:17 a.m. I noticed it the first time because I was grading papers late. The light snapped on sharp and white in the second-floor window, then went off 7 minutes later. I checked the clock without meaning to. After that, I couldn't stop checking. 7 minutes. Always 7. It didn't matter if it was a weekday or weekend, storm or clear sky. The light came on, stayed steady, then went dark. No other lights followed. No shadows crossed the window. I tried to sleep through it, but my body learned the timing. I would wake a few minutes before, heart already moving faster, and stare at the ceiling until the light clicked on next door. That was when I started noticing the reflections. My living room had a large front window. At night, it worked like a mirror. One evening, while brushing my teeth in the bathroom across the hall, I glanced toward the glass and saw movement behind me. Not a reflection of my arm or my head. Something taller, offset like a second body where there should not have been one. I turned fast. The room was empty. I checked again. My reflection moved alone. It happened more often after that. A shift in the glass that didn't match me. A shape where there shouldn't be one. I blamed the streetlights, the angle, my tired eyes. Teaching takes more out of you than people admit. One night, closer to winter, I stood at the window on purpose when the bedroom light came on next door. I wanted to see something normal to break the pattern. As the light flared, I caught my reflection clearly in the glass. And behind it, faint but distinct, were 3 silhouettes. They stood close together, taller than me, shoulders squared. They did not move when I moved. When I raised my hand, only my own reflection responded. I stepped back, pulse loud in my ears. The silhouettes stayed where they were until I turned on the room light. Then they vanished into glare. I stopped using that room at night. I kept lamps on in the back of the house and avoided windows after dark. Still, the sense of being watched didn't fade. It sharpened. The screaming started in early December. It was muffled, distant, like it was traveling through walls that absorbed most of it. It always came from next door, around the same time the bedroom light turned on. It never lasted long. 30 seconds, maybe less. Enough to wake me, not enough to pinpoint. The first time, I sat up in bed, frozen, listening for it to happen again. Didn't. The light went off after 7 minutes, and the street returned to normal. After the third night, I called the police. I felt ridiculous even dialing, trying to explain patterns and lights and sounds that stopped on their own. They came the next afternoon while I was at work. When I got home, there was no sign of activity. No cars. No officers. The house looked the same as always. A few days later, I received a follow-up notice. The welfare check found no one living there. The house was owned by an LLC based out of state. It had been empty for years. I read that sentence several times. Empty for years. I walked the length of the fence that evening, looking for signs I had missed. The grass was cut evenly, but not recently. The windows were clean, but sealed. The front door had a new lock. The garage door showed no scuffs. It looked maintained, not lived in. The bedroom light came on that night at 2:17 a.m. It stayed on for 7 minutes. I started digging on my own. Property records, old news articles, archived listings. The house had been purchased after a foreclosure, bundled with others, then passed through holding companies. No one had ever rented it. No utilities were listed under a personal name. The explanation came slowly, and only after I stopped looking for something dramatic. The house was being used as a monitoring point. I noticed it first with my own routine. The reflections in my window lined up with moments when my lights were on in specific rooms. The silhouettes were not behind me in the room. They were behind me in the glass, created by figures standing in the dark house across the street, watching through equipment that reflected my own image back at me. The bedroom light was a signal, not a mistake. 7 minutes was enough time to log activity, check feeds, verify schedules. The screaming wasn't screaming. It was audio bleed, feedback from equipment tested at low volume, bouncing between structures in a quiet street. I realized why there were never packages or trash. Everything was brought in and taken out by hand, at odd hours, never enough to leave a trail. The sedan I saw early on belonged to a contractor, not residents. I had mistaken setup for occupancy. The house was one of several in town used to observe traffic patterns, routines, and behaviors near public buildings. The school was 3 blocks away, so was a municipal office. Quiet neighborhoods make good cover. I reported everything I found to the authorities. Months later, the house was sold quietly. The light stopped coming on. The windows stayed dark. I moved at the end of the school year. I still think about that street sometimes, about how normal it felt, how friendly everyone was. I learned that safety isn't about noise or distance or knowing your neighbors' names. It's about understanding that attention can hide behind ordinary walls, and that being watched doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it feels like routine. Sometimes it feels like a light turning on for 7 minutes in the middle of the night, over and over until your body learns to wake up before it happens. I moved into the apartment in February 2019 because I needed somewhere anonymous. The breakup had left me restless, and the idea of a place that didn't care who I was felt comforting. The building was 3 stories of dark red brick, wedged between a highway interchange and a row of closed storefronts. Traffic hummed day and night. The stairwells smelled like dust and old cleaner. The rent was low enough that I signed the lease the same day I toured it. The unit was on the 2nd floor, 1 bedroom, narrow kitchen, windows that faced a concrete retaining wall. The walls were thin. I could hear toilets flush 2 units away. The pipes knocked when someone showered. I told myself noise meant life and life meant safety. The first night, I slept with the highway noise filling the room like static. Around 1 in the morning, I woke to a faint sound above me. It was not loud enough to be a problem, just enough to notice. A step, then another close together. Not a steady walk, more like someone testing the floor. I lay still, waiting for it to stop. It did not. Between 1 and 4, the sound continued. Short steps, pauses, a scrape that suggested furniture being shifted an inch at a time. Then nothing for several minutes, followed by the same pattern again. When I finally fell asleep, it was from exhaustion, not comfort. I blamed it on the building. Old places settle. People work night shifts. I worked early mornings, so I ignored it and focused on routines. Coffee at 6, shower at 7, out the door by 8. The noise didn't happen during the day, and that helped me pretend it was normal. The second night, the pacing returned. This time I noticed something else. When I got out of bed to use the bathroom, the steps above me started again. When I stood at the sink, brushing my teeth, the steps stopped. When I walked back to the bedroom, they followed 1 floor above, matching my path through the apartment. I told myself it was coincidence. Apartments stack the same way. People move around their own space. On the 3rd night, I tested it. I stood in the kitchen without turning on the light. After a few seconds, the steps above me stopped directly over the kitchen area. I walked to the living room and waited. The steps resumed, then halted over the living room. I stood there long enough that my legs started to ache. Nothing moved above me. When I shifted my weight, a faint creak answered back, perfectly timed. Sleep became fragmented. I started keeping the television on low volume to blur the sound. It didn't help. The pacing cut through everything, precise and patient. Sometimes there was the scrape of something heavy being dragged a short distance. Sometimes just the sound of someone standing still, weight pressing into the floorboards. I met him once in the stairwell a few days later. It was late afternoon. I was coming home from work, shoulders slumped, keys already in my hand. He was coming down from the 3rd floor as I was going up. He was tall and thin, wearing a jacket that smelled like cold metal and cigarettes. His eyes were open wide and dry. He did not blink while I passed him. There was no confusion on his face, no surprise at seeing another person. It felt like he was waiting for me to move out of his way so he could continue whatever he had been doing before I interrupted. I remember the sound of his shoes on the concrete steps. They were scuffed down to the sole, worn unevenly, as if he favored one foot. After that, I could not forget that detail. Every time I heard the steps above me, I imagined the same uneven pressure, the same shoes. The pacing grew more deliberate after that. It was no longer just at night. If I came home early and moved around the apartment, There would be a delay, then the steps would begin above me. Always the same pattern. Short steps, sudden stops, no rush. If I stayed still, the steps would stop too. I started keeping track without writing anything down. Bathroom visits, trips to the kitchen, standing by the window. Each movement had a response. The timing was never instant. There was always a few seconds, like someone listening carefully before moving. I stopped feeling alone in the apartment. Even during the day, I felt watched from above. The ceiling fan became a marker. I could tell where he was by the faint vibration through the blades when he stood directly overhead. One morning, after another night of broken sleep, I went to the leasing office. I told them about the noise, about the pacing, about how it seemed constant. The woman behind the desk checked her screen and frowned. She told me the unit above mine, 3B, had been vacant for almost a year. She said there had been maintenance issues and that no one had lived there since the previous spring. She suggested the noise was from the building settling or from someone in a different unit. I walked back to my apartment with that information pressing into me. The idea that no one lived above me did not calm me. It sharpened everything. That night, the pacing was worse, louder. The scrape sounded closer, like it was happening just above the ceiling, not on a finished floor. I started noticing other things. The ceiling above my bedroom had a patch where the paint looked newer. There was a vent cover that didn't sit flush. The screws were stripped, the metal bent slightly outward. When the steps stopped directly above my bed, I could hear breathing through the vent. Slow, controlled, not labored. I didn't sleep that night. I lay still and counted the seconds between movements. I tried moving quickly from room to room. The steps followed, lagging just enough to confirm intent. Whoever was up there was not guessing. They were tracking sound and position. The next day, I called maintenance and reported a loose vent. They came while I was at work. When I got home, the vent cover was tighter, but the screws were still damaged. The paint patch looked untouched. That night, the pacing stopped for the first time since I moved in. The silence was worse than the noise. It felt deliberate, like a held breath. Around 2 in the morning, there was a new sound, a soft thud, not from above, but from within the ceiling itself. Then another closer to the bedroom wall. Something moved through the space between floors, slow and careful. The building had old service corridors, narrow gaps for pipes and wiring. I could hear metal brushing metal, insulation shifting. I stayed still until morning. When the sun came up, I packed a bag and left. I did not return until I had spoken to the property manager again, this time insisting on an inspection of the unit above mine and the ceiling space. They found him living in the building's maintenance crawl space and the vacant apartment. He had been there for months, moving between units through access panels and vents. He used the empty apartment as a place to wash and sleep during the day, then spent nights in the crawl space, listening. He knew the layout by sound. He followed tenants by the echo of footsteps, by the water in the pipes, by the hum of appliances. The shoes with the uneven wear matched the scuff marks on the beams above my ceiling. The meeting in the stairwell made sense then. He had been using the stairs to move between floors, blending in when necessary. The smell of metal came from the tools he carried. Cigarettes masked everything else. He was arrested without incident. The police told me he had been doing this in other buildings before he was caught, choosing places near highways where noise covered his movements. He said nothing during the process. His eyes stayed open the entire time. I broke my lease and moved out within the week. The building looked the same when I left. Brick, traffic, no sign of what had been happening inside its walls. Even now, when I hear footsteps above me in a new place, my body reacts before my mind can catch up. I listen for the pauses. I listen for the way sound follows. And I remind myself that this time, the unit above me is occupied, and the ceiling is solid, and no one is waiting in the dark space between floors. I moved there in late August of 2014 because rent was cheap and I needed to be closer to my job at the paper mill. I was working rotating shifts, mostly nights, and the drive from my old place was wearing me down. The rental house was narrow and long, pressed between woods on one side and cornfields on the other. There were no sidewalks and no streetlights. The road was gravel, pale and dusty during the day, dark and uneven at night. Bugs swarmed the porch light every evening, thick enough to leave smears on the siding if I brushed past them. The house itself felt temporary, like something built to last just long enough to be forgotten. Thin walls, cheap locks. The back door stuck unless I lifted it while turning the knob. The landlord lived 2 counties away and handled everything through email. He didn't ask many questions. I didn't offer many answers. My nearest neighbor lived about 50 yards away, close enough that I could see his house from my kitchen window, far enough that it felt wrong to walk over without a reason. His place sat lower than mine, closer to the tree line. He had built his own fence, a rough line of boards that wrapped his property on 3 sides. The boards didn't match. Some were gray and split, others looked newer, darker, still holding sap stains. Every board faced inward. The clean side pointed toward his yard. From my side, it looked like the back of something unfinished. I saw him the first morning after I moved in. I was drinking coffee on the porch, still half asleep, when the sound started. Hammering. Slow, steady hits, always in the same rhythm. I checked my phone. 5:40 a.m. exactly. I watched him from a distance. He was tall and thin, wearing the same dark jacket every morning. He never looked up. He never adjusted the fence or replaced broken boards. He just added, 1 board at a time, placing it carefully, driving the nails in deep, then stepping back to study it before moving on. This became routine. Every morning at 5:40, the hammering started. It didn't matter if it was raining or cold. It didn't matter if I was coming home from a night shift or leaving early. He was always there, adding to the fence. He never waved, never spoke. I tried once, lifting my hand as I walked to my car. He didn't react. He didn't even glance my way. After that, I stopped trying. The smell started after the first heavy rain in September. It drifted across my yard in the evenings, sweet at first, then sour, like something left too long in the heat. It clung to the air and soaked into my clothes if I stayed outside too long. I checked around my place, thinking maybe an animal had died under the porch or in the crawl space. I found nothing. The smell always faded by morning, then came back after the next rain. At night, his porch light bothered me the most. It stayed off until I stepped outside. The second my door opened, it clicked on. Every time. I tested it, stepping out for a moment, then going back inside, then out again. The light followed my movement. It wasn't on a timer. It wasn't random. It felt deliberate. I started locking my doors during the day. I kept the curtains closed at night. The fence between us grew longer. Boards stacked tighter together, closing gaps that had once let light through. I noticed that the boards were placed close enough to block sound as well. The hammering echoed less over time, swallowed by the wood. One morning in early October, after a night of steady rain, I found boot prints along my side of the fence. They were fresh, pressed into the mud near my backyard. They ran parallel to the fence line, stopping just short of my shed. The prints were narrow, lighter than work boots, with a shallow tread pattern I didn't recognize. They didn't lead to my door. They didn't cross my yard. They just followed the fence, slow and careful. I checked my locks again. Everything was secure. I told myself it could have been the landlord checking the property, though I knew that wasn't true. He always gave notice. He never came out in the rain. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small changes around my place. The trash bin lid was open when I knew I had closed it. The shed door was slightly off its latch. Once, I found a length of wire lying near the back steps, rusted and bent like it had been cut from something else. I threw it away and tried not to think about where it came from. The smell grew stronger, settled low, near the ground, especially around the fence. After rain, the soil near the boards looked darker, almost slick. I avoided that part of the yard, mowing in wide arcs to stay clear of it. One night, after a late shift, I noticed something new. A narrow gap between 2 boards near the far corner of the fence. It wasn't there before. The boards around it looked recently placed, the nails still bright. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the dark space beyond. I couldn't see into his yard. The gap was angled inward, designed to allow someone inside to see out, not the other way around. The next morning, the gap was gone. I started documenting things. Dates, times, smells. The hammering at 5:40 never stopped. Even on weekends, even on holidays. I took photos of the fence when I could, careful not to be obvious. Each week, it grew thicker, reinforced with crossboards and extra nails. It stopped being a fence and started becoming a wall. In November, the county posted notices about an investigation in the area, a missing person case. A man last seen leaving a bar 2 towns over. The notice included a photo. The face looked familiar, though I couldn't place why. I didn't think much of it until I noticed the boots in the photo. Narrow, light tread. That night, the smell was overwhelming. Heavy rain had soaked the ground, and the air felt thick enough to taste. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the rain hit the fence. Water ran off the boards in thin streams, pooling at the base. I noticed the soil sinking in places, collapsing into shallow depressions. The next morning, the hammering didn't stop at 5:40, continued well past sunrise. I watched from behind the curtain as he worked closer to my side of the fence than ever before. He carried a shovel. He didn't look rushed. He didn't look nervous. He worked like someone finishing a long task. I called the county sheriff's office that afternoon and reported what I had seen and smelled. I gave them dates, times, photos. They took it seriously. A deputy came out the next day, walked the property line, and marked the ground near the fence. They brought in more people after that. They found remains buried along the inside of the fence line. Multiple sites, shallow graves spaced evenly, each one aligned with a section of the fence. The boards weren't just added for privacy. They were markers, each board placed after something new went into the ground. The neighbor was taken into custody without resistance. His house was searched. Tools were collected. Records were found, carefully kept, detailing dates and conditions. Rainfall, soil softness, smell mitigation attempts. He had chosen the location because it was quiet and overlooked. He built the fence inward so no one would see the care he took with it. The investigation lasted months. I was interviewed several times. I gave them my notes and photos. They told me the man in the missing person notice was one of the victims. There were others, some identified, some not. I moved out before the case went to trial. The landlord didn't argue. The house was condemned soon after. The fence was torn down. The ground was excavated and filled in. I still wake up early sometimes, expecting to hear hammering at 5:40 a.m. I don't, but when it rains, the smell comes back in my memory, sweet and rotten, drifting across a yard that no longer exists. I moved into the house in late spring of 2016. It was a small ranch on the edge of a suburban development that had started to spread into the countryside. The lawns were wide, the streets straight, and most of the houses looked new enough to still smell of paint. I rented the place because it was cheap and quiet, and I wanted a break from city life. The nearest neighbor lived about 30 yards away, tucked behind a line of hedges. He was an older man, stocky, with a face lined from years outside. The first time I saw him, he was trimming his bushes. He looked up, nodded once, and went back to work. That was it. No greeting, no wave, nothing more than that nod. I noticed him more in the following weeks. He had routines. He left before the sun fully rose and returned just after it set. He mowed on Saturdays, always in the late morning, starting at the far end of his yard and working his way toward the house. When he trimmed the hedges, he did it with precision, clipping in straight lines, nothing left ragged or uneven. There was a method to everything he did, a rhythm that seemed constant, unchanging. I began to sense it the first week I slept through a storm. Rain pounded the roof, wind rattled the windows, and I swore I could hear footsteps in the grass outside my bedroom window. Heavy, deliberate, slow. I brushed it off as the trees swaying, the gravel shifting, the way rain can play tricks on your ears. I didn't give it another thought. By the second month, I was leaving work at odd hours and noticed him too often. He was always outside when I pulled in. Sometimes he would be at the end of his driveway, staring at his yard. Sometimes he would appear in my peripheral vision, standing behind the hedges, motionless. I never caught him moving directly toward my house. He just observed, always from a distance that was too close to be coincidence, too far to be threatening, but close enough to make me tense. The first real sign that something was wrong came one evening in August. I had left the back door unlocked because I was carrying groceries. When I returned, I noticed the lock had been latched. I had done nothing. The lock clicked as I tested it. It was smooth, precise, too neat. I went inside and checked the kitchen. Nothing appeared disturbed. Cabinets closed, drawers in place, groceries untouched. Still, a shiver ran down my spine. From then on, I started noticing patterns. Trash left out at night would be pushed neatly against the curb. My lawn chairs, which I had arranged in a semicircle around the fire pit, would be aligned perfectly parallel to the house the next morning. Once I left a small toolbox in the garage. When I came back, it had been moved into the corner, stacked neatly on top of a box. Nothing was missing, nothing broken, but everything was rearranged. One night in September, I woke to a sound I could no longer ignore. Slow, rhythmic on the porch steps. Not pounding, not hurrying. Just deliberate, measured steps circling the perimeter. I held my breath, staring at the ceiling. The steps paused at the sliding glass door. I could hear a faint scraping, like nails against the edge. Then they continued around the other side of the porch and stopped. Hours later, I checked and found no footprints in the gravel. I tried to rationalize. Animals, wind, imagination. I even joked to myself that maybe it was the neighbor, though the thought made my stomach turn. He was always out there, but never crossed the line, never made a sound that would confirm presence. Still, I began locking every door, even during the day, even when I was home. Over the following weeks, my unease grew. I noticed things missing. A garden glove, a small packet of seeds. Not valuable, not important, but gone. Other items were subtly altered. My rake leaned against the fence differently. The hose coiled neatly on its reel when I had left it tangled. It was not chaos. It was order imposed on my space. My space had been observed, catalogued, and managed by someone else. In October, the steps on the porch returned. I sat inside, in the dark, listening for hours. They came almost exactly at midnight. Slow, precise, methodical. They paused at the sliding door, moved around the corner, and stopped. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. My heart raced the entire time. I noticed then that the backlight of his porch flicked off at the same time. He had timed it. I realized that this had been happening for months, that he had seen me leave, come home, sleep, and wake countless times, that my routines were recorded in some mental log used to guide his actions. Every movement, every habit, every small detail had been observed. The rearrangements, the steps, the small intrusions, they were his way of asserting control without crossing a line I could detect. The final incident came in late November. I returned from work to find the mailbox open, my letters rearranged by size and color. The garden gate, which I always locked, was latched. The lawn furniture was stacked in a precise rectangle. I stood frozen, staring at the yard. The realization hit all at once. This was not curiosity. It was possession. He had made my property an extension of his routines. My privacy was an illusion. I never confronted him. There was no evidence that could hold in court. I could not prove anything beyond observation, speculation, and small intrusions. Instead, I moved out 2 weeks later. I packed quietly, sold the furniture I couldn't take, and left a note for the landlord, claiming personal reasons. The neighbor watched from his porch as I loaded the truck. He nodded once, the same nod he had given when I first arrived. The house was quiet after I left. I imagine the routines resumed immediately for the next tenant. He would have learned their habits in a week, observed their patterns, and resumed control. The streets were straight, the houses orderly, the lawns trimmed, and the people unsuspecting. I never returned to that neighborhood. The memory stayed with me not because of fear, but because of realization. Some people do not intrude in obvious ways. Some people assert influence quietly, slowly, and methodically, using time and observation as their tools. I learned how small the space of privacy can be, how little it takes for someone to map your life without ever stepping across a line. That understanding is what stayed with me, clear and heavy, long after I had gone.